Marco Rubio assumed it would be simply another easy panel, but that night, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett would change everything. Crockett pulled out her notes and called Rubio out on live TV while he was doing his address. This exposed his lies and left him scrambling for words in front of the whole country. It was supposed to be a normal policy panel that was broadcast live from a studio in Arlington, Virginia. There are 3 cameras, a round table with 4 guests, and 1 moderator in front of a beige wall. But things changed as soon as the camera started rolling. Rubio, who was known for his smooth delivery, sat across from Congresswoman Crockett, who was sitting still, her eyes alert, and her thoughts ready. The conversation started with a topic that everyone knew about: U.S. policy in the Middle East, sanctions, security, and strategy. Rubio started off strong, saying that the current administration's foreign policy was weak and that easing sanctions was putting American lives at risk and giving Iran more power. But Crockett didn't believe it. She waited patiently for her time, adjusting her mic before speaking up clearly and calmly. "Senator, do you mean the strike that happened last month in Erbil?" she questioned, surprising him. Rubio blinked, which meant he understood the hit, but Crockett wasn't done. "That's interesting," she said, "because the Department of Defense sent out a briefing just 2 weeks ago saying that the group behind the strike wasn't supported by Iran's state military." Rubio blinked as he tried to understand what she was saying. Crockett didn't stop there. She went on to clarify him about the current drone activity, saying that the last known Iranian-sponsored drone attack had been about 8 months ago. She even had the most recent briefing from the Pentagon, which she was ready to use to refute all of his fraudulent claims. The studio got eerily quiet since the people at home didn't know how tense things were. Diane Kerr, the moderator, even seemed to know that something had changed. Crockett's next words hit like a bomb. "If you're going to say that this government is making Iran stronger, you should at least have some up-to-date information to back it up. This isn't 2021. That sentence stuck. It wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was sharp enough to cut through the air. Rubio, who normally talks a lot, was quiet for a time, but he rapidly got better and gave a feeble argument by saying, "We all interpret intelligence differently." Crockett's answer? "I'm not interpreting. I am reading it. You may check it out for yourself. It's public." She was sure of herself. This wasn't just a moment for her. It was a chance to hold Rubio accountable, and she was ready. The audience got to see behind the scenes as the panel went on, discovering how Crockett had carefully planned for this moment. 3 days before the panel, her office was still lit up late at night, and documents were all over her desk. She read through intelligence reports, transcripts, and news articles with great care, trying to make sure that when Rubio went on national TV and spoke with confidence, she would have facts to back up every lie. Lionel Burke, her chief of staff, saw her work hard, understanding that this wasn't simply a discussion, it was about making sure that the truth got to the American people. Crockett had even gotten declassified information from the State Department, which showed that the attacks Rubio talked about were not as clear-cut as he made them sound. She didn't want to sound scripted, so she jotted down anchor points instead of a script to make sure her answer was spontaneous and based on facts. Crockett was ready when the day of the panel finally came. She arrived into the studio with a clear mind and a goal after running, taking a cold shower, and not eating breakfast. Rubio was already in his seat, glancing at his notes with the same confident smile he always has. He had no idea that Crockett was watching him closely, not with bad intentions. Rubio kept pushing his story that the administration's foreign policy was weak during the discussion. He used drone strikes and other events as proof that Iran was becoming more aggressive. His slick, planned speech may have easily changed the minds of anyone who was still on the fence about him, but when it was time for Crockett to speak, she was ready. She gently clarified what Rubio said by pointing out the DoD's own March 18th bulletin and showing that he was lying. The studio got uncomfortable, but Crockett wasn't simply checking the facts. She was setting a trap. Rubio had already stepped right into it, and he didn't even realize it. The panel was intended to move on to another topic, but Crockett wasn't done. "Diane, if I may," she said, and then she turned back to Rubio. She purposefully took another card out of her folder. "It's not only the information, Senator. It's accountability," she said. Then she talked about a Forbes resolution from May that was meant to strengthen diplomatic protection standards for U.S. people in the Middle East and Rubio's objection to it. This was the ace she had been holding back, a bill that could have made things safer for more than 900 Americans stationed abroad, but Rubio voted against it. Rubio sought to excuse himself by saying that there were parts of the resolution that he didn't agree with when he realized he had been caught. But Crockett didn't care. She firmly told him that his opposition had killed the whole bill, putting diplomats and soldiers at risk. She didn't speak out. She didn't have to. She knew the facts and wasn't scared to utilize them. There was no applause in the studio. There weren't any dramatic soundtracks or close-ups of the camera. But people were listening harder than ever at home, in living rooms all around the country. Jasmine Crockett didn't just examine Marco Rubio's facts. She had him answer to the whole country. This wasn't just a political argument. It was a lesson in how to hold the powerful accountable with only facts and the fortitude to stand up for what you believe. Rubio shook his head. "That's not fair. It's documented," he replied, but Crockett didn't change his mind. She pushed another piece of paper toward him, not in a showy way, but like giving testimony in court. "You can't sit here and act like national security is your top priority while voting against the tools that keep our people safe. That's the gap I want people to see." Rubio tried to answer, but she didn't allow him the chance. "Senator, let's be clear. You had the chance to make the embassy safer. You had the same intelligence reports that we all got, and now you're blaming the government for the attacks while refusing the money that could have stopped them." The studio felt colder, and even Diane Kerr didn't say anything. Crockett wasn't yelling. She never raised her voice. But the way she spoke had changed, steady and unrelenting. She knew her facts like they were written on her flesh. Rubio breathed out through his nostrils and tried again. "Politics is all about what matters most. My vote was based on worry about how the money was being used," she said, cutting in but not angrily. "Using money wrong? The same bill contained ways for both parties to keep an eye on things. If it was really what you were worried about, you could have suggested a change. But you didn't. You just voted no." Rubio sat quiet, his eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in thought. He turned to Diane. Crockett looked at the camera. "Every time someone uses fear to lie to people about threats from other countries, we get closer to another pointless intervention. And every time a leader bypasses the specifics to sound tough, people die." It wasn't a big deal. It was dry, serious, and it hit hard. People at home weren't hearing spin. They were getting receipts, and Crockett was giving them out like free flyers on the street. The control room was in a panic behind the scenes. Producers whispered through headsets, wondering if the feed was too raw and if this was going off script, but the numbers showed that viewership was going up. Rubio's fingers nervously tapped on the desk, but Crockett was calm. The job was done, and her folders were closed. She leaned back, breathed out through her nose, and said, "We have a duty to be honest, especially when lives are at stake." The moderator finally broke the silence. "If we can't even agree on basic facts, we're just feeding the chaos. We're going to take a break for a commercial." No one moved. The screen went black. The camera stopped working, but the people didn't. There were already a lot of reactions online. When the cameras came back from break, the usual wide-angle shot of the panel made it look like nothing big had happened. But people who had been watching from the start knew better. Something had already changed. The way Senator Rubio stood had changed. He sat up straight and crossed his arms tightly over his notes instead of leaning in. Jasmine Crockett, by contrast, looked like she had just finished her first lap. Steady breath, relaxed shoulders, eyes forward. Diane tried to reset. "Let's pivot to regional diplomacy, how the U.S. works with strategic partners in the Middle East to ensure mutual safety and cooperation." Rubio jumped at the lifeline. "That's exactly why leadership is so critical right now," he said. "We can't afford hesitation. Our partners, Israel, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they're watching our every move. They want consistency. They want strength. Crockett turned toward him again. You mean like consistent funding for diplomatic safety initiatives? She asked, but he ignored the jab. Our enemies don't respect delay. That's what I've said for years. If we signal weakness, we invite confrontation, he added. Jasmine gave a single nod. Let's talk about signals then, she said. Diane shuffled in her chair. There it was again, that tone Crockett employed when Puzzo Ford when Titter's diets entity, and Thakulana. She was going to thread a needle. Back in April, she continued, the Foreign Relations Committee proposed a clause that would renew funding for surveillance systems in 3 high-risk consulates. Rubio, you were informed on the threat assessment, same as all of us. Rubio glanced sideways, jaw tight. The clause passed through the committee with near unanimous support. Then it got to Senate floor, and you voted it down. He started to speak, but she wasn't done. You didn't just vote it down, Senator. You went on record declaring the law was fiscally bloated and symbolic at best. You argued it wouldn't actually hinder attacks, but just a month later, an incident occurred in Manama where antiquated perimeter tech failed, 2 guards injured. She paused just long enough for the weight of that to land. You called it symbolic. They term it a breach. Rubio sought to change his reaction. That bill had multiple problems. It packaged too many unrelated apps. The phrasing was rushed. She replied instantly. You could have proposed improvements, but you didn't. You destroyed the whole thing and blamed the administration. That's not how to lead. That's how it looks. Diane said, Congresswoman, what are you trying to say? Crockett added, looking Rubio in the eye, I'm saying that when it comes to national security, words are easy, votes are harder. We have too many people who act like they're concerned on camera, but then disappear when it's time to do the real work. Rubio sat in silence for a beat too long before giving a half smile. Listen, I respect the Congresswoman's passion, but passion doesn't always mean policy. She didn't move. And vague metaphors don't erase your voting record. The moderator tried again, let's keep this constructive. But it already was, at least for the people who were watching. People at home weren't hearing a fight. They were hearing what happens when someone shows up ready and keeps others to it. Rubio looked off camera for a second toward the producers, which Crockett observed. It was a small gesture. He was used to rooms that were safer, panels that were pleasant, and questions that were easy to answer. He wasn't used to being held accountable. Jasmine had the receipts, which were printed, highlighted, and had the date and time on them. She leaned forward again, but not in an angry way. It was more like a surgeon. You've served in the Senate long enough to know what it means when someone uses fear to sway opinion. You know what that leads to. So, I need to know, when you say we're encouraging confrontation, do you mean confrontation with Iran or with the truth? That sentence hit harder than any yelled allegation. Diane even sat back in her chair. The studio didn't go crazy. There was no clapping, no gasp. Just quiet, dense, and waiting. But Crockett's queries didn't need to be loud. They needed to play again. And that's exactly what was going to happen on every screen in the country. The environment had changed in some way, not loud or dramatic, but there was a tension that didn't go away, even when the subject moved. Diane sought to get things back on track by asking another guest, former Ambassador Calvin Morley, for advice on how to change alliances. Morley replied with a long, boring answer about energy corridors and strategic trust. Rubio nodded, but it was evident that he wasn't really paying attention. He tapped the edge of the table with his fingers in a steady rhythm, left, right, left. During the segment, Crockett didn't say anything. She didn't have to. She sat still, with her hands resting on the folder in front of her and her eyes fixed on it. She looked at Diane every now and then, but never at Rubio. Not even once. The producers started cutting to Rubio's face more regularly now, which was probably not on purpose. It was modest but important. He was no longer the main focus. The camera was looking for his reaction. His self-esteem had taken a knock. He took longer to answer, and it felt like he was sifting every word through 5 levels of caution. Rubio cleared his throat when Diane came back with a question on the Strait of Hormuz being worse. Well, it's clear that it's a tough situation. I understand the Congresswoman's point of view, but I think she's making assumptions about people's motives that are hard to verify from this side of the world. Jasmine eventually turned to him. No, she answered, I'm not assuming. I'm reading declassified briefings and comparing them to what I've seen on tape. You're the one making guesses based on old or incomplete information. Rubio glanced at her, trying to find a way to stand. That's not completely right, he said. You're right, she said. It's not all the way. It's totally. That answer hit strangely. It wasn't smart. It was done via surgery. Diane slowly breathed out through her nose, evidently striving to get back in control. Please, let's keep it about policy. Jasmine didn't push it. She nodded too. Diane in a polite way and then went quiet again, but the moment had already passed. Rubio drank more water, then more. People working behind the scenes were texting like crazy while watching the live video from Capitol offices. One staffer to a Republican senator from Florida typed, "Someone should have prepared him better. She's killing him on Twitter." The video of Crockett asking Rubio over the vote on embassy funding had already been watched 400,000 times in less than 15 minutes. Someone has slowed it down and added subtitles, repeating her remark, "They call it a breach," over footage of the actual attack in Manama from security camera stills. TikTok wasn't too far behind. A user entitled at Facts and Fury posted a composite of Rubio stammering and Crockett methodically flipping through her notes. The caption said, "Who's the symbolic one now?" The response wasn't the same on even conservative forums. Some people supported Rubio by saying that the debate was unfair and too prepared. Others, though, asked tougher questions. Why didn't he explicitly refute her? Did he really vote against that money? Where are the receipts? Diane went to a commercial break when she got back to the studio. Her voice sounded more clipped, as if she was trying to put out a fire that no one had told her about. As the camera zoomed out, she remarked, "We'll be back after the break with our panel's final thoughts on the future of U.S. diplomacy." The panelists took their microphones off slowly. Rubio slumped back in his chair, his collar wet. He looked at the producer who was off stage and asked for a towel. A crew member gave it to him without saying anything. Jasmine stayed still. She quietly took off her microphone and put her folders together. Lionel mouthed the words, "You're golden," to her from backstage. She smiled for a moment but didn't say anything. Rubio turned his head and eventually said in a hushed voice, "Didn't think we were going to get personal tonight." Jasmine didn't blink as she looked at him. "It's not personal, Senator. It's open to the public." But this moment wasn't going to stay in the studio. Everyone who had been told to accept half the story could already hear it on every screen, stream, and voters thinking. By the end of the evening, Jasmine Crockett's name was trending on X, not just in political circles, but also on timelines full of people who don't usually watch foreign policy panels on weeknights. Hashtag Crockett Clarity, hashtag Rubio Exposed, and hashtag Receipts Matter. The hashtag spread like wildfire. In less than an hour, the clip of her gently spreading declassified reports across the table got 1 million views. Someone put dramatic music over it and made it fit with Rubio's awkward quiet. That version went much faster on TikTok. Young creators put together the exchange with their reactions. One person replied, "This is how you shut someone down without raising your voice." Another person, who was standing in front of a whiteboard, explained the law Crockett talked about. "Here's what Rubio voted against." No spin, just the facts. Even Instagram was busy. Political influencers, who usually remained away from TV news, posted screenshots of Crockett in the middle of a sentence with titles like, "We need more of this energy in D.C." At the same time, Rubio's side was getting louder. For about 5 hours after the panel ended, His team didn't tweet anything. No statement, no further explanation, no retweets, just nothing. Staff were running around inside his Senate office. One aide recommended quickly writing a thread to explain his vote. Another person offered they should make a video response, but Rubio said no. "We don't want to keep this going," he said under his breath, but it was still alive. The next day, several morning shows showed clips from the encounter. Even Good Day Tacoma had a program called Crockett versus Rubio. Who had the facts? People from the area called in to provide their opinions. A veteran from Pasco, Washington, who was older, stated, "I don't care what side you're on. That lady came with the facts." He looked like he had just gotten there. It really hit home when Liberty Grounded, a conservative podcast, made a rare turn. Colin Greaves, the host, is known for championing Republican hardliners, yet he started the show with an unexpected point of view. He said, "I don't usually agree with Jasmine Crockett, but last night she ate his lunch. I mean, she really knew what she was talking about." "He wasn't ready," his co-host said. "And when you vote against protecting your own people abroad, you better have something stronger than symbolic funding." That was a miss. Rubio's aides viewed the video without saying anything. People who were part of his base were even asking inquiries. His Florida district mailbox started to fill up with emails from people asking about the embassy security law. Some were nice, while others were not. Crockett's own staff hardly slept that night. By midnight, they had more. 4,000 messages in their inbox. Half of them were from media groups asking for interviews, and the other half were from fans congratulating her. One note said, "I'm a military mom." Another person said, "That moment gave me hope again." At 2 a.m., Lionel texted Jasmine a screenshot of her face next to a meme of a courtroom gavel with the caption, "She brought the court to the table." Jasmine didn't answer because she was finally asleep. The next morning, her staff released a short, well-written statement saying, "Congresswoman Crockett is grateful for the chance to set the record straight on national television. She thinks that public service is about being honest, not putting on a show, and she looks forward to more talks based on accountability." Nothing dramatic, just firm ground. Rubio's squad still hadn't decided how to respond, though. At noon, they sent out a dry, deflective tweet that said, "Last night's discussion showed how hard our global problems are to solve. It's good to disagree. Let's focus on solutions, not sound bites." But it didn't work. People didn't believe it. In response, one person said, "She had folders. You had vibes." Even his normal supporters on talk radio spent more time talking about how uncomfortable he was than defending his point of view. And what about Crockett? She went on Morning Current and said it again, but she didn't brag. "It's not about Rubio," she remarked. "It's about how facts get lost in political theater. If you can't say the truth, maybe you shouldn't be the one speaking for the country." But what began as a single acute moment was growing into something more. People weren't only watching the fight, they were also watching what happened afterward, and the fractures were starting to appear. Before the light even struck the marble steps outside the Capitol the next morning, Jasmine Crockett was already up, hair pushed back, and coffee in hand. She sat quietly at her kitchen table in Bethesda, scrolling through her phone, not because she was vain, but to check the weather. When she saw her name trending again, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat over the viral edits, the side-by-side comparison shots, or even the dozens of messages from coworkers quietly saying, "You did what a lot of us wish we had the nerve to do." She just took a slow sip of coffee and let the pressure settle back into her chest. She knew that yesterday wasn't the end. It was the start of a bigger storm. Around 7 a.m., her team came in. Lionel was the first to arrive. He had a hefty folder and a phone that had been vibrating since he got out of his car. "We've got CNN, MSNBC, ABC, and even the BBC asking you to come on," he added. "Roland wants to bring you on for a town hall next week." Jasmine looked up. "Has Rubio said anything real yet?" "Not really," Lionel said. "Just that tweet, vague, general, and completely avoiding the vote." She groaned. "I don't want this to turn into a meme war." "It already has," Lionel responded, putting the folder down. but it's also becoming something else. He opened the folder. Inside were polling snapshots, early, unstructured, but they showed how voters felt. Rubio's popularity among independents had gone down a little, while Crockett's popularity with swing voters had gone up. More interestingly, military families and veterans groups were sharing her panel video again, focusing on how she voted on the embassy financing. This wasn't just a takedown, Lionel stated. It was a live demonstration of clear policy. Clean. No yelling. People are starving for that, Jasmine said as she sat back in her chair. I need to keep it about the job. I don't want to be in the news. I want the policy to stay in focus, she said. What's going on in his office? Lionel quickly looked down at his phone. Their press secretary tried to get him to do an interview on Sunday, but he said no. And this morning, his team circulated a statement saying they were unfairly attacked during the panel. Jasmine blinked. It was planned. Lionel nodded. We all got the same briefing pack. I know, but they're trying to make you look too aggressive, like you were rehearsed, and he was caught off guard. She let it settle for a minute. Translation: they're losing control of the story. At that very time, the tone in Rubio's Senate office was strained. There were no positive tidings on the phones, and the doors were closed. Kendra Groves, his communications director, had a printout of the most important things people said about him. Most of them weren't good. She stood by the window and said, "Look, we can't pretend the panel didn't happen. People saw it. They are still watching it. The more we try to change direction, the more it appears like you're avoiding us." Rubio sat at his desk, staring at a picture of him shaking hands with foreign leaders in Israel from years ago. "What do you think?" he asked. "Don't deny," Kendra urged. "Make it clear. Talk about how long you've been committed to national security. Frame the vote as a disagreement over language, not over principle." He didn't answer. She went on, this time in a gentler voice, "Or we say nothing." Rubio finally looked up and said, "Hope the wave passes." She made me look unprepared. "Because you were," Kendra said, but then she stopped herself. "I mean, you didn't think she would bring updates that weren't classified." He scratched his temples and said, "That's on us. We need something to change the story back to Jasmine's side." But that change was already happening, not the way he wanted. Her office was getting calls from veterans groups asking for updates. The Gold Star family from Missouri had asked her to speak at a security conference next month. Editors were getting ready to write think pieces with titles like "When Preparation Beats Performance." Jasmine stayed focused even though she knew the momentum was building. She instructed Lionel off camera, set up a roundtable with embassy staff next week. No press. I want to hear from them directly about what they're going through. What is absent? Lionel raised one eyebrow. Are you sure? It's not really a headline moment. Good, she said. I'm not going after headlines. I'm looking for the truth. But while Crockett was focused on moving forward, Rubio's team was still trying to fix what had happened the night before. And they didn't have much time. By the end of the week, things had changed on Capitol Hill. On the surface, everyone still wore suits and courteous nods, but underneath, talks were quieter. The staff is more careful with their tone. People had watched what happened live and understood they couldn't act like it hadn't happened. People talked about Jasmine Crockett in meetings that had nothing to do with her district. People started to pay attention to her, not out of doubt, but out of respect. Some people rolled their eyes behind closed doors and said she was lucky because she caught Rubio on a bad night. But the fact is, they knew better. What she accomplished wasn't luck. It was getting ready for a time that was sure to happen. The tale spread like wildfire in places far from the Capitol. A group of veteran military officers brought up Rubio's vote on the embassy funding bill at a town hall meeting in Jacksonville, Florida, and things became very lively. One man stood up and held out a printed copy of the panel's transcript. "This is what being responsible looks like," he remarked. "He had a chance to protect us, and he walked away from it." In Albuquerque, A high school civics teacher played a clip of the exchange in her classroom. Not the dramatic parts, just the quiet moment where Crockett said, "If you can't agree on basic facts, we're just feeding the chaos." She asked her students what that meant. A kid in the back said, "It means the truth has to come first, even if it's not easy." Things weren't the same even among Rubio's supporters in Florida's 27th district. People who supported the cause weren't leaving, but they were asking things they hadn't thought about before. Hosts of local talk radio took calls from voters who were confused. One man added, "I like Rubio, but she made some good points." He didn't say anything back. He danced around it. His co-host took a moment to think before saying, "Yeah, it's hard to come back from that type of public exposure when someone has you point by point." Crockett's momentum, on the other hand, didn't feel loud. It felt planned. She didn't hurry to take advantage. She didn't show up on every show that requested her to. Instead, she flew to Colorado Springs to talk to military wives about how the base housing was. No press, just notes, listening, and following up. One mother told another, "She talks like someone who already knew this, not like she just learned it." Rubio's staff in Washington worked to change the way things were. A newsletter sent to supporters said, "This week, Senator Rubio stood his ground during a tough panel on foreign policy. While others showed off, he focused on his experience and tactics, but it didn't work. People remembered the perspiration, the quiet, and the papers he never counted. The encounter didn't happen where it should have." A satirical political cartoon in the desk. Moyne Herald portrayed Rubio in a boxing ring with gloves on. Crockett stood outside the lines, calmly holding up a piece of paper called Actual Facts. The caption said, "She didn't swing. She referenced." That picture made it all the way to White House officials. But Jasmine stayed out of the spotlight. A reporter stopped her in the corridor and asked how she felt about being a political rising star. She just smiled and answered, "I'm not interested in rising. That's all I want, clarity." She didn't say anything about Rubio, and she didn't have to. The ball had already hit the ground. What she said and how she said it had nothing to do with making him feel bad. It was about not letting fabrication look like truth, and people saw it. One email from a person in Erie, Pennsylvania said it best, "I don't care if I agree with you on every issue. This week I saw someone execute their job the proper way, with respect, facts, and a backbone. Thank you." The email wasn't dramatic, but it was honest. That was the aspect that Rubio's team couldn't change. As interest swelled and things changed behind the scenes, one question remained: what would Crockett do next? And who would be ready for it this time? The tale was no longer popular 2 weeks later. The hashtag got slower. The clip stopped going around. The media moved on to the next hearing, the next scandal, and the next shiny item. But the folks who saw that moment between Jasmine Crockett and Marco Rubio will always remember it. Veterans met for their monthly brunch at a small VFW hall outside of Cheyenne, Wyoming. They didn't talk about Crockett like she was famous. They talked about her as if she had done the job, like she had really come forth with the truth. A man who had served 2 tours in Iraq and was now retired put down his coffee and stated she didn't grandstand. She didn't brag. She just knew what she was talking about. That's what I want to see, not readiness or performance. Jasmine didn't surf the wave when she got back to D.C. She didn't put her face in interviews or chase after a moment that had already done its job. Instead, she began writing a new bipartisan resolution that would require all members of the Foreign Policy Panel to get real-time briefings. A matter of procedure. Be quiet. Useful. But she still believed the same thing that night. If we can't agree on the facts, we aren't debating at all. On Tuesday, Lionel gave her the first draft. "It's not flashy," he remarked, "but it's the kind of thing that lasts." She looked up from the paper. "Good. I'm sick of flash." And that was the difference. People didn't remember the Crockett-Rubio exchange because it was loud. It was remembered because it wasn't. Because one person quietly, thoroughly, and without name-calling, spin, or loudness held another person to their own words. In politics, that kind of event doesn't happen very often, but it leaves a mark. Rubio didn't want to talk about it in interviews weeks later. He answered, "It's not about one night," when pressed directly. He was right when he said it's about a career of service, but he couldn't explain what had truly transpired, and maybe that was the point. People forget what they say. They forget about taglines, but they still remember how they felt when someone told the truth in a place where it wasn't expected. One panel didn't change the world for Jasmine Crockett. She didn't change the rules right away. But she reminded people, ordinary, tired individuals simply trying to get through the day, that the facts still count, that preparedness beats posture, and that staying calm when others go for shortcuts gives you strength. In a political environment full of performance, its clarity felt like a breath of fresh air. For every young person watching that panel who wondered if they would ever be heard, for every voter who was tired of being talked to instead of talked to, and for every professional woman who has ever had to come into a room knowing she would be underestimated until she spoke, that moment meant something. It was a message: get ready. Know what you're talking about. Don't give up when the room grows quiet. Let the truth do the work. And as Crockett left the studio 2 weeks ago, she didn't slow down. She walked past the flashing phones, the producers who weren't sure what had just happened, and the individuals who worked for Rubio who were whispering outside the corridor doors. She tightened the strap on her backpack, looked at Lionel, and asked, "What's next?" Because she wasn't after headlines. She was looking for the truth. She'll be ready the next time someone sits across from her and tries to bend it.